What is left communism? Isn't communism already left-wing? At some point, you've probably asked yourself this question, and that's probably how you've ended up at this video. Well, luckily for you, I'm here to give you the answer that many people have probably failed to give you. When many a baby leftist dip their feet into the cesspit that is online Marxism and leftism, they are bombarded with a bunch of new terminology. They will often be castigated for not knowing much or for not reading theory. Usually the person they're asking questions to doesn't know shit either, but since they've been a communist for about a year or so, they feel dialectical enough to shit on you for the crime of being a social democrat. During some unfortunate day, you might encounter someone who identifies as a left communist. Hopefully, this never happens to you. At another point, you might stumble upon an argument where someone denounces another person as a left com or an ultra. Usually, this will be preceded by idealist, revisionist, dogmatic, and most commonly, infantile. When you're talking to one of your Marxist, Leninist, or anarchist buddies, they might tell you how much they hate left comms. Every fucking day. Left com this, left com that. The Marxist Leninists might say that they hate them because they are anarchists, liberals, or racist. The anarchists might say they hate them because they are tanky authoritarians or fascist. Two things that aren't exactly the same. 9 times out of 10 when left communism is mentioned, someone will obligatorily mention that they should read Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. To show you how often this actually happens, I've stumbled upon a thread where someone who was faced with the exact same dilemma of pondering what left communism was tells us that I got banned from r/communism and r/communism 101 because I made a flippant response when someone asked the question, what is the difference between left communism and Marxist Leninism? The only response was, Lenin wrote a book on this, Left Communism and Infantile Disorder. I expressed that it was concerning that the only suggestion in response to that question was to read a book by a critic and provided no further explanation. I was banned from those subreddits for that. I'm still curious. What the hell is the difference between left communism and ML? Why is there hostility towards it in communist circles? I've long considered myself a socialist. I've read Marx, but I really don't understand why left communism is literally out of the question for those who consider themselves communist. As I've scoured the internet, Reddit that is, here are some of the answers I've seen to the question when asked, what is left communism? Basically, left communists are Marxists who aren't Leninists, so-called because they consider themselves to be to the left of Lenin. Yes, all communists are leftists, but within leftism, there can still be a left-right spectrum. People who attack socialism from the left, their peers basically, the ones who say, well, this isn't a socialist country because Marx said this, disregarding material conditions and history. You'll also find them today attacking every single organization and refusing to organize at all. Trots are one example, but many don't like Trotsky either. Basically, they are communists who disagree with the Leninist theory of a transition state, usually saying that it's a revision of Marxist theories. They also disagree with the idea of a vanguard party, saying that it will inevitably lead to the creation of a privileged elite and another state, like in the Soviet Union. They believe that a revolution should directly form a communist society with direct democracy, worker control, and a lack of hierarchies, and they can often be compared to collectivist anarchists. People sitting on their ass doing nothing but complaining about actually existing socialism. Left communists effectively are those who identify as Marxists, often of the Second International kind, who disagree with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and call the Bolshevik Revolution a social democrat one. Lenin called it an infantile disorder, and I have to agree. How left something is inane and abstract and of no relevance, and the very existence of left communism is a mudslinging attack against the Bolsheviks for not doing some mystical revolution that doesn't hurt anyone. Left comms are left in rhetoric but right in practice, and they tend to believe all liberal propaganda against Lenin, Stalin, Mao, the DPRK, so on, so forth. They are not deliberalized. Someone also says that you should also look up Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. They are left comms, but worse than Trotskyites. They literally support Pol Pot and Gonzalo, who both support active terrorism in pursuit of communism. And here we have perhaps the most dialectical analysis of left communism thus far. The Euro-communist is the Euro-supremacist, white nationalist birthchild of neo-Marxism and left communism. It is loosely defined, but has three common tenets: the advocacy of a united socialist Europe, an extreme rejection of liberalism, and a rejection of Marxism-Leninism. Said advocacy of a socialist European Union usually never advocates socialism outside of Europe, nor does it advocate for anti-imperialism and decolonization. This is shown by a rejection of anti-fascism, thought to be infiltrated by liberals, and the Black Lives Matter movement, also thought to be infiltrated by liberals. These two thoughts have been influenced by left communism, especially Amadeo Bordiga's applications to it. I'm not going to respond to any of these, but I'm showing them to you just so that you can get the gist of the varied opinions on what left communism is by those who don't know shit about it. Now, I have seen people who have given far more detailed answers, correct answers. Essentially, they know and understand the basic and popular idea that historically there are two trends of left communism, who, despite sharing a name, had virtually nothing to do with each other. The Dutch-German trend of left communism is more often than not called council communism, and it is sometimes derisively labeled councilism by people who consider its emphasis on workers' control to be a form of workerism and economism that makes its ideas no longer communist, but only councilist, hence the name. This is something which I will later demonstrate is a straw man. The much more well-known left communism is the Italian trend, which is simply just called left communism, or as they call themselves, the Italian communist left, which is associated mainly with Bordiga, but he is not their only figure, just their most well-known. In very generalized terms, the latter Dutch Germans are the anti-Leninist, and it is this group, along with some others, who are the subject of attack by Lenin in his famous left-wing communism, not the Italians, as it is sometimes mistakenly believed. But at the time when the book was published, they were not exactly anti-Leninist, or even opposed to Lenin, really. For example, in December of 1918, Anton Pannekoek of the Dutch-German left would write on the subject of democracy that once it is clear to the working masses that the goal of their rule should be the construction of socialism, the necessary expulsion of the bourgeoisie from this rule becomes apparent. The interests of capital cannot be allowed to have a say. Formally, this is of course no democracy, but in actuality, it is a higher, better form of democracy, the workers' democracy, representing the living interests of the masses. This is precisely what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is what is now called communism or Bolshevism. It has now been implemented on a big scale in Russia after the Paris Commune in 1871 showed its first beginnings. In this text, he shows his support to Lenin and the Bolsheviks a year into their reign. Gorder, another figure of the Dutch-German left, would have considered himself to be a Leninist, and even after Lenin subjected his group to critique in left-wing communism, and even after he responded to those criticisms in his open letter to Comrade Lenin, still found himself promoting some of Lenin's texts. Their historic party was the KAPD, or Kommunistische Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, Communist Workers' Party in Germany. This party had even attempted to gain admission into the Communist International when it split from the KPD in 1920. However, they were rejected by its leaders, Zinoviev and Karl Radek. The Dutch Germans, despite using the term counter-communism or Rete Communisten as early as 1918, did not create for themselves a distinct ideology until the later 1920s and early 1930s. It is around this time that the anti-Leninism that the trend is known for would develop. The main theorist parties and organs of this movement were Paul Matic and Karl Korsch, with their magazine, The International Council Correspondence in the United States, Anton Pannekoek, the KAPN, and the GIK in Holland, and the KAPD in Germany, which published two newspapers, Kommunistische Arbeiter Zeitung und Der Proletarier. The Dutch Germans, again, generally emphasized proletarian self-activity, their motto being Marx's statement that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. They were opposed to vanguard parties, with some believing in revolutionary spontaneism. Otto Rühle would infamously state that the revolution was not a party affair. They were opposed to the idea of a party dictatorship and instead held up the idea that the mass of workers will rule in a class dictatorship. They greatly emphasized the role of the Soviets, or workers' councils, during and after the revolution. Paul Matic would go as far to say that the rule of the Soviets themselves was the dictatorship of the proletariat. They opposed reformism, parliamentarianism, and social democracy. They also considered unions to be counter-revolutionary. And lastly, they characterized the Russian Revolution as a bourgeois revolution. This position of rejecting Leninism that this trend holds is often misapplied to the Italian trend, who actually pride themselves as being Leninist, or as Bordiga once said, more Leninist than Lenin. The typical charges of anarchism, libertarianism, or anti-authoritarianism, which are levied at Bordiga and his kind, are misapplied ones, especially since our friends over at the ICP would self-identify as totalitarian. The historic party of the Italian left, unlike the German left, who split from their party in 1920, was the original Italian Communist Party, at first called the PCDI, Partito Comunista d'Italia, Communist Party of Italy. Bordiga was this party's first secretary. This party published a newspaper called Prometheus. After fascism came to power in Italy and the leadership of the Italian Communist Party was organized on lines favorable to the Comintern, many of the Italian fraction found themselves in exile, some in Belgium, some in other countries. In 1943, however, the Italian left would regroup in the PCInt, Partito Comunista Internazionalista. They published a newspaper called Battaglia Comunista. This group, founded in 1943, was formed after the Allied invasion of Italy and the subsequent collapse of Mussolini's dictatorship in the south of Italy. Bordiga was not a member of this party. In fact, Bordiga was not politically active at this time. He would not rejoin political activity until the 50s, and at this time, he would become a member of the new International Communist Party, which published the magazine Il Programma. This party, however, is not to be confused with the Internationalist Communist Party, which is an entirely separate group. The Italians, in general, are also opposed to reformism. They were also anti-parliamentary, or more accurately, they were abstentionist, which is a little bit different. Unlike the Dutch Germans, they identified 1917 as a proletarian revolution, and in major contrast to them on the subject of the vanguard, they identified the class within the party. Therefore, a party dictatorship for them was a class dictatorship. The party was central to their thinking. Bordiga rejected the concept of total democracy in the party, and instead of a sort of democratic centralism, he envisioned something that he called organic centralism. Later, a left communist named Dahmen would critique this concept. Another concept of the Italians was the idea of the invariant program, the unchanging line of the communist program that stretched from Marx and Engels down to Lenin, a communist program which had remained unchanged, the communist program which called for an anti-democratic communist rule through the Communist Party and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The characteristic platform of the Italians around Bordiga was laid down at Livorno in 1921 at the founding Congress of the Communist Party. These trends, as you can see, didn't have much in common other than their being the left faction of their respective communist movements, and despite being grouped together, had little to do with the other in the early 1920s. At best, they ignored each other. At the worst, they were butting heads. The criticisms which the Comintern levied at the KAPD were at the same time held by the Italian communist left. As G. Duvet puts it, Anton Pannekoek regarded Amadeo Bordiga as a weird, sectarian, pro-Lenin Marxist, and Bordiga viewed Pannekoek as a misconceived mixture of Marxism and anarcho-syndicalism. Neither took any real interest in the other, and like strangers who shared the same story, the German and Italian communist lefts largely ignored each other. At times, some groups would switch allegiances, so to speak. Examples of this are a group from the Italian left led by Michelangelo Pappalardi, who departed with the Italians and their journal Prometeo in 1929. His group made a public announcement of their turnover to the Dutch-German trend of thought in their magazine Left Communist, and an article titled Pour sortir du marais, leaving the swamp. The same occurred with the Communist Workers' Organization and Organisation des Jeunes Travailleurs Révolutionnaires, which abandoned their Dutch-German orientation and adopted Italian positions. In the 1970s, however, at the establishment of the International Communist Current, historic members of both lefts came together for debate and discussion. There have, however, been some attempts to synthesize the position of these two lefts. This is a very basic and generalized idea of these two trends, especially with the Italians. For more on them, I would recommend reading The Italian Communist Left, A Brief Internationalist History on the ICT website, leftcom.org. The thing is, in about any school of thought, you're always going to have sects, branches, splits, these sorts of things. The best example of this is with your Trotskyists. Historically, you've had your Pabloites, your Marcyites, your Cliffites, your Third Campites, the Schachmanites, your Johnson Foresters, your Archaeo-Marxists, and so on and so forth. Even when someone tells you that they are a Marxist-Leninist, this could mean so many different things. In fact, there's at least one group of so-called left communists which historically have referred to themselves as Marxist-Leninists. So, even within both of these two trends of left communism, you've had multiple other trends, splits, and groups with varying ideas, which I will explore more in depth in future videos on both respective trends of left communist thought. We should ask, however, where does the term left communist and ultra-leftist come from? Did these people call themselves that? The short answer is no, but before we get into that, I will delve into the term ultra-leftist. First, because this term is also used in tandem with left communism, and also interchangeably at times. However, upon further research, I think that they should be used separately. There is a relationship between the two terms, but they aren't the same. To get an idea of what I mean, I'll use the example of Ruth Fisher, the principal ultra-leftist turned McCarthy supporter. Ruth Fisher was, by Marxist-Leninist and Trotskyist standards, an ultra, but she was by no means a left communist. The reason I say this is because she had no connection to either of the prevailing left communist trends. I have not found any connection between her and Bordiga, and as a Comintern adherent, She certainly had no connection with Pannenkoek. The closest connection I have found between Fischer and Bordiga is a speech where Stalin is discussing the disease of ultra-leftism in the KPD. He says that he can respect and believe in Bordiga because he says what he thinks, but he has no belief in Ruth Fischer because she never says what she thinks. In a letter to Karl Korsch, Bordiga even outright dismisses any prospects of working with her, essentially stating that she was opportunistically adopting an oppositional stance. Up until her expulsion from the KPD, she was an agent of the Comintern, chiefly responsible for the Bolshevization of the party while she was its leader, something she later bitched about. It was Zinoviev who sponsored her and her partner, Arkady Maslov, as well as Ernst Thalmann, up until Fischer and Maslov fell out of favor with Zinoviev, as well as the whole Comintern leadership, due to what we shall call Ruth Fischer's antics. Basically, she was crazy. She was, however, upon being expelled from the KPD, grouped with an parliamentary opposition called Links Kommunisten, or Left Communist. But there was no unity of ideas in this group. They had no clarity on such questions as the United Front, the national question, and other ideas worrying communists at the time. In fact, they weren't even a group, really. The one thing that they had in common was that they were members of the Reichstag who were, to varying degrees, on the left wing of the KPD until they were expelled for one or more reasons. This group eventually splintered in 1928, and some members joined the Trotskyist Lenin Bund under Hugo Urbans, and later the Trotskyist movement as a whole. Ruth Fischer was one of those, ironically. Others, like Karl Korsch, became council communists. Fischer, before becoming an arch anti-Stalinist and later arch anti-communist in the wake of her partner Maslov's assassination in Cuba, had tried and failed to rejoin the KPD when they offered amnesty to those who renounced their heresies. Fischer had captured KPD leadership in the mid-1920s. It was her, Maslov, and Sholem who led the KPD and represented its left wing. Left wing, but not exactly left communist. It was your types like Ernst Schwarz, Ivan Katz, and Karl Korsch who would have been the genuine ultra-left within the party. They would have held what you call left communist positions. The council communist Paul Maddock, in a review of Ruth Fischer's book Stalin and German Communism, which is actually a self-serving eulogization of herself and her quote-unquote struggle in the KPD, says that if Ruth Fischer speaks persistently of herself as representing a left opposition, it must be pointed out that this left factionalism had nothing whatever to do with the actual attempts of German radicals to oppose the totalitarian rule of Bolshevism. Her work went on within the Bolshevik Party and relates merely to the manipulatory needs of the Russian overseers in the early stages of their developing totalitarianism. However, in Moscow, all these people were grouped together as ultra-left for their hostility to the NEP and their characterization of the Soviet Union in 1926, mind you, as counter-revolutionary. For example, Ivan Katz referred to Stalin as Bauern Napoleon, Farmer Napoleon. Ultra-leftism, defined, at least from ML standpoints, just means having extremist or sectarian views, or partaking in adventurous actions. Stalin, during the third period, was characterized as partaking in ultra-left adventurism by the right opposition, as well as by Trotskyists. The term ultra-left is 9 times out of 10 followed by anarchist or adventurist, and it is used as an insult. When Lenin wrote left-wing communism, he used the term ultras to describe his targets in the books. In fact, the term left-wing communism is also an invention of his, and he used it to describe the left wing of his party, led by Bukharin and Radek, in the wake of 1918 and their opposition to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. He identified similar patterns of thought within both the Dutch German and Italian lefts, but specifically the Dutch German left. From his perspective, they were going too fast because, in his mind, they wanted to make a revolution when the conditions for it weren't ripe yet. The leftism which they exhibited was opposition to parliamentarism, opposition to working in reactionary trade unions, and opposition to the Versailles Treaty. It's not that Lenin thought these things were bad per se, just that they were the wrong tactics at the moment. Left-wing communism and infantile disorder by Lenin is not an ideological attack. It is an attack on tactical positions. It is a historical work, and it has its relevance, but it's not an uncompromising takedown of left communism that many people seem to think it is. People who at times hold ultra-left positions are not always left communists, but oftentimes a left communist might hold a so-called ultra-left position on something. This term, I think, is highly abused, however. In a footnote in the article series, What Was the USSR? The Aufhebung Collective Rights, ultra-left is a loaded and ambiguous term. It was originally a term of abuse used by Lenin against communists and revolutionaries, particularly in Western European countries such as Holland, Germany, and Italy, who refused to accept the Bolshevik model of revolution and the right of the Russian Communist Party to determine the tactics and leadership of the world communist movement. On the term itself, it should be noted that most people accused of ultra-leftism by Leninists would argue that they are simply communists and that the left, including their accusers, are not. The matter is further confused by the tendency of Leninists to denounce each other for ultra-leftism for such heinous crimes as not voting labor. There also existed in China during the Cultural Revolution various quote-unquote left communists and ultra-left groups such as Xingu Lian. I will be talking about these groups later in future videos as well, but for these groups to be labeled left communist, I feel as though that is a misnomer because they, just like Ruth Fischer, had zero connection to the historical left communist movements, the Dutch, German, and Italian communist lefts. Regardless, we will still be talking about these groups as currents of left communism in China. My next few videos will be talking about the various trends of left communism in far greater detail than I presented in this video. I'll be discussing their history, their ideas, the people behind them, and the rise and the fall of these trends. The first trend that I will be talking about is the original trend, so to speak, that is the Russian communist left, which existed from perhaps 1917 to 1937. That year, 1937, is when its last leaders were killed in the camps in the Soviet Union. However, some of its members lasted a little bit longer than that. The last person to be a member of a left communist faction in the Soviet Union died in 1972. The last people who never capitulated died in 1945 and 1953. I will be analyzing the development and evolution